So this is Couch Advocacy 101, or how to be an environmental advocate during a pandemic. And we are partially figuring this out with you. And we're here to share experience that we've gained over the years as an organization and that we're developing kind of on the spot with you. So first, I just want to go over a little bit of an agenda for the night, and well, hopefully we won't spend longer than 7 minutes on this, but we'll do some intros and some shared goals and objectives. Then we're going to be talking about how to explain why it's really important to continue speaking about the environment and advocating for it right now. Then we'll do climate change and COVID-19 stuff. Then we'll talk about environmental justice, then the power of coalitions, and then how to interact with the government and get your voice heard. Then there'll be a quick little bathroom break / snack break. Oh, I think there we go. Then we're going to go into breakout rooms, and then we'll have a little bit of a closing. Okay. So if any of you have social media, we have Facebook and Instagram or Twitter, and you can feel free to open up any one of those and let people know that you're here in this workshop. In particular, feel free to go to Twitter and tag us. Our hashtag is Couch Advocacy for tonight. And you can let us know that you're talking about us by tagging ANS tweets. And we also have our own personal accounts that you can feel free to tag. Now we're going to do some introductions, and these are your workshop leaders for tonight. So Eliza.
Hello, everyone. I'm Eliza Cava. I'm the Director of Conservation at Audubon Naturalist Society, and I'm thrilled to have you all with us. I'm thrilled because this is a wild time, and we need everyone. We need to come together and work together for environmental protection, and it's just so great that so many people are here and are bringing themselves in what I know is got to be a challenging time for many of us. So thank you all for coming. And I want to tell you a little bit about Audubon Naturalist Society. We're the oldest independent environmental organization in the DC area. This is our 123rd year, and we are indeed an independent organization. So we're not affiliated with any other Audubon society. And we do way more than birds. We also do land and water, climate change, transportation, green infrastructure, and more. And we have 2 sanctuaries that you can visit. Wood End Sanctuary, our headquarters in Chevy Chase, Maryland. The grounds are open right now. And our other sanctuary is called Rust Sanctuary. It's in Leesburg, Virginia. The grounds are not open right now, but hopefully will be again soon once all the states of emergency are lifted. And we do a lot of environmental education, both in school and out for kids and adults, nature field trips, classes, and we work on restoring our Wood End Sanctuary in all sorts of really exciting ways. And finally, this is our conservation program. And in addition to our conservation advocates who are leading the workshop tonight, we also run several water quality-based community science programs, one of which has been running for more than 25 years, monitoring streams in Maryland and DC. So I encourage you to check us out. If you're not a member, consider joining. We have really fantastic classes and programs, and we really appreciate everyone's support. And thanks for coming tonight.
Thanks, Eliza. And I'm Ari Eisenstadt. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the DC Conservation Advocate. So I work on DC specific climate policies, stormwater, equity issues surrounding the environment, and nature access. And I'm really glad to be here with you all.
I'm Renee Grebe, pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm the Northern Virginia Conservation Advocate. So my purview covers much of Northern Virginia, including Fairfax County, Loudoun County as our 2 primary counties where we work. And we work a lot on, again, water quality and often on redevelopment plans and comp plan amendments.
My name is Denisse Guitarra. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and ella. And I'm the Maryland Conservation Advocate at ANS. I work primarily in Montgomery County and Prince George's counties, and my work surrounds transportation, equity, engaging with a lot of our non-traditional folks like communities, Latinx communities, and a lot of immigrant communities. And I'm really excited to have you all join us tonight, and thank you for coming.
Hey everyone, my name is Christian Mioli and I'm a Chesapeake Conservation Corps member at Audubon Naturalist Society. And the Chesapeake Conservation Corps is a program run by the Chesapeake Bay Trust. So it places young professionals in environmental nonprofits and government agencies for a year. So I'll be helping out tonight with technical support.
We are super, super grateful to have Christian here helping us out, preventing any Zoom spamming and trolling. So we'll give him another round of applause at the end. And now, let's see. Okay, so we're gonna go over some shared objectives and just a little bit of norms here. So first of all, I think you all, most of you were here when I mentioned that when you come onto the Zoom, your mic will be muted automatically. And in order to unmute yourself, which we ask that you try not to do until you get to the breakout rooms, just so that we can keep to our schedule, just press the microphone and it'll unmute you. And as much as possible, we're asking that everybody try to put aside distractions. We completely understand this is a tough time, so if you need to be on your phone to check in with family members or friends, that's totally cool, but try to bring as much of yourself here as you can. And in that same vein, please also try to push yourself to engage. I know that I myself have been feeling a little bit of sort of lethargy and resistance to really, you know, using all of my noggin. This is a tough time, and it takes a lot of energy out of you. So we're just asking to bring as much as you can to this, especially into the breakout rooms. And then some shared objectives. We're hoping tonight that everybody will leave with the knowledge that you have the power and the right to take action on environmental issues. This is supposed to be a really empowering workshop, and I think even the presenters will probably end up feeling really empowered by your presence here too. And we also hope that you know that your voice matters. And this is a really difficult time when it feels like, you know, there are people making decisions for all of us. And so we hope that this helps everybody understand that there are things that you can do to get heard, and that it's important that you do. And another thing that we hope everybody leaves with is the knowledge that it just takes practice. As professional advocates, we're constantly practicing, we're constantly learning. And it's just, advocacy is a muscle, just like any other. And hopefully this will be just a little bit of an advocacy workout for us all. Okay, so again, I think most of you have done this, but if you have joined in the last few minutes, please rename yourself with the initials of the jurisdiction, either Maryland, Virginia, or DC, next to your name, depending on where you would like to be sorted into a breakout room to learn once we get to the latter half of our workshop. Okay, and I think we're ready to rumble. Eliza, take it away.
Okay, that was challenging because you're steering my screen, but now I have it back. So what I want to talk about is, why does protecting nature and the environment matter? And for many of us, this may be self-evident, and I would encourage you to use the chat box to communicate as we go with us. Whoever's actively presenting will probably be a little unable to follow what you're saying, but the rest of the team may be able to weigh in, and also to introduce yourself to your fellow attendees. So, you know, share a little bit as I talk here about why protecting nature and the environment matters to you. Because one overarching thing I want to put on here is that your voice as a resident, a citizen, a voter, and I say those in those orders because all those people matter, even if you're not a voter, if you're a citizen, even if you're not a citizen, if you're a resident. But what really matters is that you are representing yourself and telling your story to those in power who then represent you and make decisions. So understanding your reasons for why protecting nature and the environment matter is really incredibly important. And I'd encourage folks to share in the chat window. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the ways in which I think it matters and which it matters in some broader senses to society. Assuming, okay. So we need nature. We need it for lots of reasons. Right now, nature is the only place that we are allowed to go. Well, physically distant from one another on trails and things through our region. I mean, we need nature in so many ways. We need the resources that it provides to us. We need food. All of our food comes from nature. And we need it more than ever now. When natural spaces are being closed, we really feel it. we really feel it is the only place remaining. And I think that it's elevated the value of natural spaces in so many people's minds. And here's an example of a great photo I saw. You see the desire line? That's the word for that path in the grass there in that lower picture. That's from people trying to stay 6 feet away from other people on that path. That's a new subpath right now. So we need this space in nature. We need it now more than ever. And we're going to talk more about this, but of course, the health disparities that we suffer in society because of unequal exposure to pollution has been coming up in the data as one of the contributors to morbidity and mortality from COVID-19. So this crisis is in a lot of ways highlighting just how important nature is to us for our physical health, our mental health, and our public health. And there it is, it's one of very few places to be able to go with your mask on right now. And nature needs us. Again, you can see that by the ways that our kinds of air and water pollution have let up in so many ways dramatically around the world, the air quality being the most visible one. I do want to point out that air quality reductions in specific places is not the same thing as reducing our overall carbon emissions, but it is really, really relevant to see that when we stop a lot of our activity, especially our driving and transportation, nature in many ways cleans up real fast. It needs us to protect it. It needs us to plant trees. Without us to counter bad actors who would use nature as a dumping ground, nature is going to get polluted and it's going to get lost. So those are some of the reasons so far that I've got why it's important to protect nature. And then I think there's a justice issue here. We all deserve access to a healthy environment, and that's whether we're people, whether we're animals. We should all have the same kinds of access to these resources because of how important they are to us as humans and as animals. So how do you talk about this stuff in a pandemic? And this is, where it becomes tricky, because it's easy to say, it's really easy to say right now it's budget season. Oh gosh, that stuff is, we're going to have to cut spending on natural resources next year. The economy is about to go in the tank and we're going to lose budget. And we're going to talk about this in great detail later on. That's going to be a lower priority item. The environment is often a lower priority item and it needs its advocates to stand up for it. But like I started saying, we can't not talk about it. The word intersectionality gets a lot of play, and it's really, really relevant here. We've got that air pollution issue with morbidity and mortality. We've got people need access to nature, safe places in nature, and decisions are happening right now and fast. And I think that's going to take us over to the climate crisis. So what the decisions we're making now in response to some of the economic fallout that we're seeing is going to affect the way we handle crises into the future. The biggest one of those crises being the climate crisis. You could say this is a warm-up act. So I'm going to turn it over to Ari to take us through a little bit about climate change.
Thanks, Eliza. Okay. So I want to start off this section with a recognition of some of the stuff that's been going around on the good old interwebs, particularly on Twitter, which is rife with talk of both climate change and COVID-19. And so this slide shows a couple tweets, the ones on the left and in the middle. And some of you may be familiar, there are some memes that have come from both of these tweets that are actually pretty funny. But this is an example of something we actually want to stay away from. The first tweet reads, "Wow, Earth is recovering. Air pollution is slowing down, water pollution is clearing up, natural wildlife are returning home. Coronavirus is Earth's vaccine and we're the virus." So that's some pretty intense messaging, and it unfortunately has some implications that tie it to things that the environmental movement that we're a part of really don't want to be associated with. And some of the responses on this tweet identified it as aligning with ecofascism and supporting eugenics. And those are some really, really intense words that we don't want to get involved in and that we don't support. And we also just need to be aware that equitable solutions to the climate crisis do not rely on mass death and suffering. That needs to be our main talking point. We can't go around and say, we can't talk about population control because this is a huge, huge problem. And the people who are most responsible for climate change are the people in the top 1% and 2% of wealth. And so we also need to be aware of environmental justice, as Eliza was talking about, and we'll talk about a little bit more later. And we also need to think about biodiversity and what that includes. And one of the things that ANS advocates for is preservation of biodiversity and intact ecosystems. And I think it's important for us all to remember that biodiversity includes humans. And just because we have a tendency and haven't quite figured out how to 100% live in concert with the environment, that doesn't mean that we can't work towards it. And so it's really important that we promote positivity around figuring out solutions and not rely on suffering to get things done. And we also want to steer away from fabrications. And this middle tweet got a lot of attention, and I did some research on it because I was like, whoa, this is so cool. And there were like some other tweets that included dolphins near Venice. And it turns out that these pictures were fabricated and are not actually from right now. They're from totally different times. And so one of the things at ANS that we really, really pride ourselves on is our reliance on the best available science. And that includes just facts in general. And so as an environmental movement, we want to be sure that we're really pushing out what we know to be 100% true and factual, especially in this time when it's really hard to get the right data. And so we're focusing on the positives as well. Also has, like I said, pretty serious environmental justice impacts or implications, because as this picture on the right shows, this is a graph from some research done by an organization called Carbon Brief. Some people are predicting that the coronavirus and the subsequent economic downturn that it's causing could trigger the largest ever annual fall in CO2 emissions, which is ostensibly, when you look at it without any context, a great thing. But again, we don't want that to come from this tragic time. And when you compare this data to other events that have caused similar lockdown situations like the Spanish flu in 1918, World War II, these are really, really horrific times in human history. And the emissions reductions that are caused by these events are always met with a huge upswing at the end. And that is partially due to the fact that governments often stimulate the economy into more production to try to bring things back into the light or into the green. And so we need to be aware that this is likely only temporary, and we need to develop different solutions to the climate crisis. And another way that sort of I'm learning to think about climate change and COVID-19 is through the lens of shared pretty much everything. And so now here we have a flow chart. Pay attention to all the colors here. And we're gonna start on the left with this red box that reads fossil fuel / CAFO, and that stands for concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFO dependent economies. And that's what we are living in right now. We have an economy that relies on fossil fuels for energy generation, for powering our cars, for pretty much everything. And we also rely on agricultural systems that deplete the earth and are based on a model of extractivism. And that is particularly relevant in concentrated animal feeding operations, particularly those that use cows and pigs, which release tons and tons and tons of methane and N2O, nitrogen oxides, which are primarily responsible for the agricultural side of climate change. And so this type of economy sort of stems off, and this is a very, very simplified model, and you could put hundreds and thousands of other boxes in here. This is just very simplified. But when we go to the top and we talk about our fossil fuel dependent economy, we then go to a long, long history of redlining and environmental racism. And what that means is that unfair and racist policies placed polluting industrial systems like power plants, landfills, et cetera, in communities of color. And those generate tons of air pollution. And when you pair that air pollution in communities of color with systemic disinvestment in community health, and that is an example of that is food deserts and the lack of a level 1 trauma center in Southeast DC. That then results in really, really high incidences of chronic disease, such as asthma, diabetes, and heart disease, all of which really, really increase the risk of complications and death from COVID-19. And then on the bottom, we have another chain, and we can see how fossil fuels and this economy that we have, as we know, causes climate change. And climate change really destabilizes environments and ecosystems all around the world. And one of the things that we're seeing now is an increase in the number of people who are fleeing and forced to flee from their homes because of unstable environments, and failing crops and their livelihoods have been completely diminished. And that then is beginning to create, and has for a while, a climate refugee crisis. And that leaves a lot of people who are undocumented in this country. And I'm not sure if everybody's seen, but the $2.2 trillion stimulus bill that was recently passed by Congress and the executive branch left undocumented workers out of relief funding. And so there was a big fat zero provided to undocumented workers. And that includes mixed couples where one partner is a citizen and one may be undocumented. And that means that if they file their taxes jointly, neither will receive relief funding. So when you pair all of these things with no relief, then you also place undocumented workers and their families at a greater risk from complications and death from COVID-19, because that means that you can't access healthcare, you can't access food, and ultimately we're seeing that people of color are dying in hugely disproportionate numbers from COVID-19. Okay. And so one of the things that we also want to talk about when we're talking about COVID-19 and climate change is they're causing, similar problems. They're affecting the same populations of people. And that means that they do have some of the same solutions. There are big solutions and there are smaller solutions. And some of those big solutions are things like relying less on mass-produced food and supporting sustainable agriculture, community farms, for example, or urban farms. And that also includes support for small businesses. And one of the things that we're seeing now is that small businesses around us are dropping like flies, and it is hurting a ton of people. And one of the climate positives of a small business-based economy is that you don't have a ton of transportation of goods from far away, like we do when we're ordering from Amazon, for example. And so that reduces transportation emissions and also really, really boosts up people's livelihoods. And then one of the other things that is a big shared solution is nature access. And as Eliza referenced, right now we're all in need of some respite, and nature is becoming a huge outlet for a lot of people. But there are also really big systemic barriers to accessing nature, particularly in communities of color. And so making sure that everybody is able to walk outside and see something green or something flowering or something alive is really important. And then smaller solutions like mutual aid networks, which are popping up all over the country. And there are a lot in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And this is just an example of some of the hotlines. This represents a community of mutual support. And that's really important to making communities resilient to things like flooding, resilient to heat stroke and heat waves. And so this model of a community that is self-sustaining and supportive is one that is a solution both for public health crises and for climate mitigation. Okay, and here's just a little bit of data to close this out on some of those shared vulnerabilities. And the bottom left is the one I'm most familiar with here as the DC conservation advocate. And this is illustrating the disproportionate number of coronavirus-related deaths among people of color. And as you can see, 81% of DC's coronavirus deaths were people who were African-American. And that's largely related to asthma and pre-existing conditions such as heart disease and diabetes. And those numbers are echoed in Maryland and Virginia. And so this is going to lead us now into a discussion about environmental justice and how to make sure that we're including folks who are disproportionately burdened by both coronavirus and climate change in the discussion.
All right, so I'm going to talk about what's environmental justice, what is environmental equity and justice. And the definition of environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, sex, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So I know that's a lot, but I think the graph to your left kind of displays it visually what this definition shows. So three terms that are kind of easily confused among environmental justice folks is equity, equality, and justice. So in this diagram, we have three people of three different heights, and they all want to see the soccer game. But they, you can see the shortest person cannot, the shortest and the middle height person can actually not see over the wooden fence. So in equality, everybody gets a box of the same height. Unfortunately, that box is not enough for the shortest person to see. In equity, you give the shortest person actually two boxes. That allows the shortest person to actually see the game, but it's still not fair. What's fair is actually justice, because you can see that we have eliminated the barrier. So now you can see through the fence, and everybody without support or accommodation can actually see the soccer game. So that's what we mean by environmental justice, is making fair for everyone. And a lot of the hurdles that we need in environmental justice is to eliminate those environmental barriers. And unfortunately, a lot of our environmental barriers stem from years of, I guess, bad land use decisions or even environmental racism. And that can be seen from a lot of the current kind of housing that's allocated in a lot of the regions that both the DC, Maryland, and Virginia advocates that we work on. So I have kind of this schematic diagram of some houses that are evenly spaced out with a lot of green space versus kind of some apartment houses that don't have that much green space. And then I'm going to walk through the benefits and burdens that these two types of communities might be facing. So I guess single family homes are kind of more high income, whereas the apartment complexes might be of low and middle income. And then this line over here is the amount of space. So you see that for high income folks, there might be more things like benefits like more parks or more dedicated bike lanes, more green spaces. So those are all great things. But for low and middle income folks, they also get things, but they're not really so good. So maybe they get more incinerators or wastewater plants or landfills closest to them. And unfortunately, there's a kind of health consequences to having all these pollutants near their homes, which means like they might have more obesity rates because they don't have as much green spaces to recreate, or they might have higher incidence of asthma. And then the high income folks might have more political power and economic power, which kind of pushes all those burdens away from that community. So environmental justice, it really is trying to make the benefits and the burdens equal among all residents in an area, and that everybody has equal access to these, and that not one is more overburdened than the other one. And we can see through data that this is actually what's happening. So Latinx, this statistics are before the COVID pandemic actually. So Latinx Americans and Black Americans are more likely to be exposed to the pollution that they produce than non-Hispanic white Americans. And as you can see, it's 63% and 56% for Latinx and African Americans respectively, and 17% less for non-white Hispanic Americans. And now, given the COVID situation, as both Ari and Eliza have said, a recent study conducted by Harvard University shows the correlation between long-term exposure of the air pollution and higher mortality rates of COVID. And actually, as one of the authors for this paper has mentioned, she says that the amount of pollutants that African Americans are breathing has not changed over time, even though we have Clean Air, but Clean Air Act has not really cleaned the air equally all throughout the US. So we're gonna transition.
Excellent. So I'll talk about the power of coalitions. Each of you all are here today because you want to make a difference, and we know that one person can absolutely make a difference. So you're represented here as your one person and this green dot on the page here. But even more powerful is something that I like to think of as small multiples. If you can convince or find others who feel the way you do, you get to multiply your voice. And when many people feel the way that you do, that larger group's message gets heard a little bit stronger. And even better is when that group can come together knowingly and form as an organized coalition. But the really A+ answer is thinking about how you bring a diversity of voices together with different perspectives on a problem to achieve that common goal. So that's where really the strongest power comes from. So as you think about your position, why you're here today, maybe you're an individual that wants to find a coalition that's working on an issue that's important to you, and you want to be able to add your voice to that group. Or maybe you realize that it could be beneficial to bring together a coalition, or maybe boost one that already exists, or maybe all of this seems really daunting to even consider, but hopefully not. A great way to broaden your perspective on an issue or to get to know the organizations that are participating on the topic of an issue is to really just get involved in some community meetings. And of course, our community meetings don't look like this anymore. They end up looking more like the Brady Bunch with all of our Zoom calls now. But it's still a great way to get comfortable and knowledgeable with the issues that you want to advocate for. You can sign up for webinars on a topic of interest. You can network with the presenters or the participants. You could be as simple as just talking to some of the neighbors that you have in your local HOA, or maybe as broad as a regionally important land use decision. But the more you understand about who the issue can impact, then the more creatively you can think about who you can partner with. So at ANS, we partner with a range of green organizations around the DMV that you might expect. I didn't list out their logos here, but organizations like Sierra Club, Potomac River Keepers, local friends groups, Potomac Conservancy, Native Plant Societies, things like that. But it's also helpful to see some examples of who we've worked with to think about how you might be able to expand your own network. And some of the organizations that we partner with are broader environmental organizations that you might not think of or you might not have heard of. Some might be more or less obvious. We also look to engage the leading organizations that are active in the communities in which we work. And we also look to find common goals and partnerships with organizations that engage in different segments of the communities that we might not normally reach through the environmental messaging that we have. So these groups might not normally come to mind, but there frequently are common goals that you can get to with those groups, like healthy communities where there's a lot of common ground to be built upon. And when you bring together those varied experiences and perspectives, that unified message can be a lot stronger. So how do these partnerships and coalitions actually work in the real world? Here's an example from some work that I did in Alexandria along the Route 1 corridor, just south of Old Town Alexandria. You can see that in the map on the side. This is an area slated for a large scale and long-term redevelopment. And today, Richmond Highway is a 6-lane, unpedestrian friendly, car heavy corridor. But the county's redevelopment plans call for changing this current corridor, which you see, into a more walkable, bikeable, mixed use business center served by bus rapid transit, BRT system. And these redevelopment plans have been coming together for years. So during this time, I wanted to get to know some of the impacted communities along the Route 1 corridor. And one community that stood out in particular as important was Gum Springs. And this community's history is really fascinating and important. Wes Ford, who was a freedman who worked as a carpenter at George Washington's estate, bought a 214-acre farm in Alexandria in 1833, right in this corridor. And so by the 1890s, 30 years after Ford had already passed, the farm was broken up into lots and it was sold, ultimately creating Gum Springs, which is the oldest African-American community in Fairfax County and one of the oldest in the nation. And even today, Gum Springs has more than 2,500 residents, with up to about 500 of them descending from the original families. That's incredible. So I began attending the new Gum Springs Civic Association's meetings to help me learn what was important to the residents that lived there. And you can see here on Google Maps, Richmond Highway is along the Route 1 corridor, and Fordson Road here is the main entrance to the Gum Springs community. And as plans for the bus rapid transit, the BRT, were coming together, I learned that the proposal for this intersection was to close the southbound access to the community, and that the Gum Springs community, as you might expect, was adamantly opposed. This community has fought to preserve the sense of community they've had in countless ways over the years. They've represented one or more ways that their community is being cut off, and this is a broader plan that the county thinks will benefit so many, but is having a direct impact on this community. And as we've already heard from others in this presentation, this equity issue just comes out in so many different ways. And so the county did ultimately present, well, we see what they had presented here. The purple line in the middle is where the BRT is cutting off that access. And the county did ultimately propose an alternative, which was great at that area. And so I was able to take these views of Gum Springs, and as we wrote comments for the BRT with our Fairfax Healthy Communities Coalition, we were able to really talk about the fact that Gum Springs really wanted this alternative, and to be able to raise that voice up and to have us, as we were making comments about stormwater goals, native shade trees along the corridor, we were also able to raise up their voice as well. And the great news is that actually we just recently, in the past 2 weeks, we got word that they're proposing this alternative that keeps that area open. This is just one way that just knowing the people that are being affected, that you can help raise others' voices as you're doing advocacy. So I will hand that back over to Ari.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts. And you have a lot of strategies now that we've discussed for how to do some framing around climate change and the importance of the environment, and how to bring everybody's voice in and really incorporate environmental justice strategies. And then also how to work with others in a coalition to really, really amplify. And so this is going to be a little bit of a more specific nuts and bolts session on how to make your voice heard. And that can be either as an individual or, as Renee mentioned, as a coalition. So the first thing to really think about is, what are the opportunities for impact? There's a lot to be done on the environment. There's a lot to be done federally, locally, on the state level, and it can be really hard to figure out where you can sort of insert your voice. And that's something that even environmental advocates who are seasoned and have been doing this for a long time still sometimes struggle with. It's hard to stay abreast of all of the developments that are happening. But there are a few pretty reliable opportunities for impact, and those include things that happen yearly, like a city or a county's budget. And right now, a lot of the places we work are in the budget season. And I work in DC, and so a little bit of our budget schedule has been thrown off by the pandemic, but we are still able to count on the fact that we need a yearly budget. And a lot of the environmental programs that we know and love and work really closely with in coalitions are funded by our jurisdictional budgets. And that's always a place where you have an opportunity to say something. And this year, a lot of us are going to have to really be making sure that we contribute to budget discussions and protect the environmental programs that exist in past budgets, make sure that those programs don't get cut, and also be sensitive to the additional funding needs that are required by the pandemic. And then also, zoning and land use changes are things that not everybody thinks about. I know our partners from Coalition for Smarter Growth think about 24/7, But for some of us, it can seem a little bit esoteric and intimidating. And so you don't even need to be an expert to be able to make a contribution on some of these conversations. You know, land use is everything. Land use is, they're building a high rise over here in my residential apartment and it's not going to be affordable. That's not cool. That's land use. You know, preventing gentrification is land use. You know, making sure that there are enough metro stops in every neighborhood so that people can use public transportation is land use. And you don't have to be an expert to say something about these things. And then there's also always an opportunity to comment or testify or send a letter on a proposed bill or amendment to an existing law in your jurisdiction. And by law, pretty much all the places that we work have systems in place that allow for public input. And so that's something we can really take advantage of. And then development projects and construction, those are always something that we find ourselves at ANS sort of wrapped up in. And one of the things that has been going on for a long time for ANS is the Beltway. And I know that many of you are familiar with that. And that's sort of a joint local federal situation. And there's been a lot of public input, perhaps not as much as there even should have been, but there's always an opportunity to make an impact on development projects. And then you can always make your own opportunity. You know, something that I've learned from mentors is that if there isn't a comment period for a specific project, you can ask for one. And that's always been kind of intimidating to me. But it is within your purview and it's your right to say, I think that the public really does deserve an opportunity to say something about this. This doesn't really seem cool. And additionally, if there's something that you see in your neighborhood, if there's a construction site that, you know, has a ton of sediment running off of it, or there's a disconnected pipe that's leaking into a stream in your neighborhood, you can say something about that. Sometimes it's hard to find who to say something to, and that's why we're going to talk about one of the other things next. Okay, so if you've identified an opportunity for impact, a really important next step is identifying who you're going to talk to about it. Who is your target and who gets to make the decisions on this project or this bill or this budget. And these are some examples from all around our service area in Virginia, Maryland, and DC. And identifying relevant decision makers isn't necessarily as hard as it sounds. There are so many decisions being made all the time by people like you and me. And it doesn't just mean executive offices in the governor's office or mayors or deputy mayors. It's people who are in departments of the environment. Each of our jurisdictions has a department of the environment. Other local government agencies that maybe have nothing to do with the environment could be having, you know, an opportunity to weigh in on a project that would affect the environment. And relevant decision makers can also include planning boards, zoning commissions, which are often people who are appointed by, you know, those around them. They're just ordinary people like you and me. Those can also include city or county council members, board of supervisors, and their respective committees. And then some of the issues that we work on very often have to do with the National Park Service because it's, you know, there's a development project slated for National Park Service land. And so there we often find ourselves working on National Park Service related projects. And then there's also the EPA, and the EPA sort of has a hand in things whenever there is an environmental impact statement required, whenever there's something happening on federal land. And then there's also departments of transportation. And one of the things that we work on pretty often is transportation issues as they pertain to the environment. And so these are just an example of all the types of people that you can talk to. And, you know, this is what makes up a place that you live, and you have the right to send an email to anybody in any of these organizations. And that's something that can sometimes be a little bit hard to grasp, that, you know, you can really just shoot an email over to somebody, but highly recommend it. And it's a really good skill. And once you've identified, you know, your relevant decision makers and your opportunity for impact, you then have sort of a litany of strategies to choose from about how you want to even do your advocacy. And right now, all of us are having to sort of adjust our strategies to suit social distancing requirements. But there's still a lot of stuff that we can do online. And first of those is to lobby an elected official. I was really sort of shocked that I ended up on a Zoom call with the chair of the DC Council the other week. And, you know, when you're on Zoom, you're sort of equalized a little bit, and it can really strip away some of the intimidation that comes with, you know, meeting in a big council building and everybody's in suits. And so shooting an email to a council member or an elected official's office and saying, you know, I have this thing I really want to talk about. You might not end up meeting with the council member or the elected official themselves, but you may end up meeting with a staff member. And sometimes that can be just as good because they'll give you a lot more time. You can also lobby an agency official. It's the same thing, sending an email over and saying, I have something I really want to talk about, and this is something that I care about and my neighbors do too. And in that same vein, you can organize your neighbors. And there are tons of ways to do that. In particular, in DC, folks use Nextdoor, which is an online platform for communicating with your neighbors. And that's a really good way to let people know that you have something going on that you want them to be involved in. You can, you know, leave flyers on people's doors. You can make your own flyers if you don't have a printer. You can call people and say, hey, this is going on. This is something I really care about. Maybe you could too. And you can also testify at hearings. And, you know, some hearings are happening online, some things are changing, some things are happening on the phone. And so never underestimating the power of a simple Google search in figuring out, you know, how things are shifting to a virtual world for the time being, because many governments are really doing their best to figure out how to make sure there's still ample opportunity for things like testifying and public comment periods. And you can also hold a Zoom rally. Some organizers from the Shutdown DC movement this past week held really large Zoom rallies, and just a great way to get energized. And you can also conduct a virtual tour for decision makers of a site you're fighting to save. And you can even invite media to follow you 10 feet behind, you know, and take a picture of you on FaceTiming with an elected official. There's so many ways you can do person-to-person advocacy while not necessarily being person-to-person. And there's also pen-in-hand advocacy. These are things you can do if you don't necessarily feel super comfortable on Zoom, or, you know, you've been Zooming all day and you have a little bit of a Zoom hangover. And you can always write a fact sheet, a one-pager, a memo, and send it off to anybody you think has the power to make a decision based on that. And you can always write a comment letter, and you don't have to be an expert on the topic. Simply saying, you know, I'm paying attention. I'm looking and I'm trying to learn as much as I can about this, and I care about this a lot, and I'm going to be watching. That's really powerful. And sometimes just the sheer number of comment letters that come in for a project really sways a decision that gets to be made on that. You can also use social media and start a website to keep track of something that you're working on. And that's a really great way to let other people know what's going on. And then you can also just write a letter to a decision maker. It doesn't have to even be during a formal comment period. Sometimes I think many of us get caught up in deadlines. I know I've struggled with this myself, and I'm like, can I really just, you know, say I have a thought about this, and I know that this isn't like a formal situation, but this just sort of came to me, and I have something important to say. That's okay. You know, these are people that are part of the democracy that we live in, and we can take advantage of that. And you can also write a piece for your local newspaper. Op-ed pieces get in the Washington Post and Greater Washington and all sorts of local newspapers all the time, and they can really be a call to action for people in your area, and let people know that you're thinking about something. And so these are all really great ways to be an advocate while we're sitting at our desks or on our couch or with our cats. And then one of the most powerful ways to participate in environmental advocacy and in society as a whole is to vote and participate in the census. And I'm sure many of you know, the census in particular really helps governments decide where to allocate resources. And if, you know, that really ties into environmental justice and, you know, which communities are getting resources that they need. And so encouraging everybody around you to participate in the census and get counted is really, really important. And then also, as we know, voting. Some big elections are coming up, making sure that you request a mail-in ballot and encourage others to do the same, and also demand from your elected officials no excuse mail-in votes.
A lot of roles needed. And this is where, if you're an introvert, you can be the analyst. You can do the research. You can help manage the database. You can help, write things. If you're an extrovert, you can be the public speaker, the one who, goes to the meetings and says this stuff, maybe on the Zoom meetings, to the decision makers. If you are a passion person who loves to who just generates a ton of ideas, you can be on tactics. But maybe somebody else who's much better on strategy should be your partner to help make sure that your tactics make sense. So there's so many roles in coalitions, and the wonderful thing is that they really can suit themselves well to the way you work and what your strengths are. Another thing I was hearing, and that was in DC, that I heard that. In Maryland, I heard the importance of personal stories. Vanessa Pinto was talking about how if you want to advocate for something, you really want to bring the people who are the most impacted, who have the most to say, and let them and their stories speak for themselves, rather than trying to represent or gather anecdotes and then present them. It's most powerful when a decision maker is presented face to face or screen to screen with somebody who really can say personally why something matters so much. And in the Virginia room, one of the things I heard was just like, these are complicated issues. There's a lot to sort out, and it's hard to find the right solution. We may not get to the perfection, but can we get better? And I heard the Virginia group brainstorming about kind of ways to pull a victory from the jaws of defeat, perhaps. Maybe that's going a little far. I wasn't there for the whole thing, but to come up with improvements. So those are some of the things that I heard and just wanted to reflect back to the group. Another thing is that each of the advocates brought sort of key scenarios that ANS is actively working on, and they're on our blog at conservationblog.anshome.org. So just in terms of what are the local issues that we're advocating on and brought the information to tonight, you can find that all on our blog, conservationblog.anshome.org. Which is, we will be sending an evaluation in follow-up materials. We may try to get the evaluation out like ASAP, and then some other follow-up materials later. So the evaluation, so that you can process it quickly while your thoughts are still fresh. So I can't promise you'll get that tonight because we weren't able to get it set up to be automated, but you'll get it by tomorrow morning at the latest. And then after that, you can expect another email from us with some more follow-ups in terms of asking, sharing contact information for people who opted in, which we'll use the evaluation. We use the evaluation to allow you to opt in, or if you don't want to do it on the evaluation, you can email us separately, and then we'll be able to share contact information, follow-up resources, things like that. So you'll get 2 emails from us. Ari, is there anything else you want to close with?
No, I just want to say thank you all so much for coming and for supporting ANS, and really wishing everybody continued health, and please reach out if there's anything that any of us can do to support you, environmentally or otherwise. This is a really hard time for us all, so thanks for taking this time to be together.
Yeah, and I have one more plug. If you're not a member of Audubon Naturalist Society, we'd love to have you. Check us out at anshome.org/join. You can download a handbook that we have on advocacy and stewardship at anshome.org/training. All this stuff will be in our follow-up emails. And if you're like, wow, these are really fascinating issues and I've never learned more about, I want to learn a lot more about them, and I kind of want to get involved in specifically the issues that you guys mentioned tonight, well, boy, you can volunteer with us and help us do the research on these issues and do the advocacy on these issues and do the coalition building on these issues. So we don't take on every single issue that exists out there as something that we can deploy volunteers to, but if it's something we've already identified as something we're working on that the advocates are leading on, we can definitely use help. So please be directly in touch with your advocate if you want to volunteer.
All right. Thank you, everybody.